What do you think that the NATO countries do not get about Russia, and why is it that they can't comprehend what Russia wants?
Well, first of all, you're a European, so you're closer to this than I am. So I'm speculating. I don't have hard, fast facts to back my statements. First of all, I think there are European leaders who do understand the truth, but they've chosen the lie. They've chosen the fiction, the narrative that says Russia is evil and a danger and a threat, and they've hung their future on it. They know that at the moment they admit that what they've said about Russia is false, what they've imputed to Russia is false, and that Russia's national security interests in eastern Ukraine are legitimate and always have been from the very beginning, and the reason for this conflict is all about the rights of Russian citizens to speak and read and write their own language and have their own culture in schools. The minute they admit something like that, they're through. They've had it. And I think the globalist governments, whether it's Starmer, Macron, or Merz, are in a lot of trouble. There's no question about it. The other aspect of this, of course, is the debt problem. We're all locked into the debt spiral. At some point, we're going to spiral into the dirt. The financial system is going to collapse. And when that happens, we'll have to reset the currency. And there will be a certain period of time where there's chaos. But eventually, you will get new governments because you have people like the Alternative for Germany and all the European states right now. But we're not there yet. We're in this twilight zone between what I just described and the past, which is Russia's evil, Russia's bad, we all have to stand fast. And making these impossible commitments financially to military buildup. You know, Germany can't pay for itself as it is. When I was over there the last time, everybody told me flat out that the medical system, the medical insurance system was bankrupt. That's been going on for years. It's bankrupt all over the place, but particularly in Germany and Austria. Well, if that's the case, how are you going to fund yourself when you try to build up a military structure? And it takes, conservatively speaking, 10 years to build a viable new military establishment. And that's really what everybody has to do. They've got to start over. That's why all this business about a European peace force or something on the ground in Western Ukraine is just nonsense. It's hot air. It's meaningless nonsense. What are you going to send over there? The president of Poland has wisely, Nawrocki, the new one, has wisely said, no, there will be no Polish troops on the ground in Ukraine, period. Well, they've already been over there. They had several thousand people killed or wounded. They don't want to go back, and they realize the folly of this whole thing. That's good news. And they need to go further, obviously. But I think the Orban model is going to become increasingly popular in Central East Europe. And that spells the end of the EU and NATO. All of these things are coming. They're on the horizon. Just as if you look at our situation here at home, gold is now the reserve currency, not the dollar. Nassim Taleb has been telling everybody that for the last 6 to 12 months. He's right. Our position is very fragile. All of these things are going to sort of come together and crash simultaneously. And it's going to prevent any further nonsense in terms of war in Ukraine or war with Russia. It'll all end.
Yeah, well, yeah, I am closer to Europe, but I always make the point, this is the side I don't, well, understand the least. I mean, I can understand the Russian position. They see this as an existential threat, that is NATO's incursion in Ukraine. They will do what it takes. I get this. The Ukrainians see the Russian invasion as an existential threat. I can understand why they're fighting. If the United States wants to pivot to Asia and then unload this disaster of a war on the Europeans, and they're willing to do it, well, great. I can understand the American position as well, but I don't understand they're always the European. I heard some theories that is that they're being captured by their own narratives. There's an opportunism, perhaps, to centralize power in the EU. They would like to prevent the Americans from leaving. There's just this good old-fashioned hatred of Russia. So, the Russophobia keeps living strong. But also one which is very convincing, which is the unwillingness to give up on a very powerful proxy army, because they built up this army in Ukraine was hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers who could function as a very powerful containment or balance of the Russians. And if they accept the neutral option for Ukraine, in the future they might have to fight on their own. I'm not sure.
Well, it depends on what you understand neutrality to mean. And that's why the Austrian state treaty is continually raised. I've been raising it certainly since 2014. In fact, I couldn't understand why there wasn't a plebiscite, because it was patently obvious that Ukraine was deeply divided along ethnic, linguistic, and cultural lines. But we're all caught up in this fantasy that everybody has to live with everybody inside a multinational, multicultural, multilingual, whatever construct. This got started under the Clintonistas, as we call them, under the Clinton administration in the 90s. And we've been struggling with this ever since. That's why you can't see what's happened in Ukraine as separate and distinct of what we did in Bosnia-Herzegovina or in Kosovo. Everything is aimed at the same objective, which is to transform Europe into this multicultural mess with open borders and no national identity, no national culture. It's a sort of Bolshevism in a new form. The interesting thing is, where Bolshevism started has become the bulwark of national identity, national culture. And Russia is standing up for Europe in ways that no one ever anticipated. The Russians are telling everybody, we're Russian, we're not going to become something else. Why don't you be Europeans? Eventually the Europeans are going to understand this. I think the population in Germany is beginning to grasp it. Even some of the people in Poland are beginning to see past their sort of limiting hatred of Russia and all things Russians to figure out that, the EU is not a place where you as a Pole or a Hungarian or anybody, German, can be what you are. The EU is this highly centralized octopus that is there to dictate to you everything that you will be. And this thing we call European values, which is absurd on its face, is being used as an instrument to beat everybody into submission. Open your borders, admit more Africans, admit more people from the Middle East and from Southwest Asia, pour in, and then we'll all be happy. Even in Germany, where the Germans have put up with this nonstop since 2015, 10 years, they finally begun to realize this is a catastrophe. It's impossible. But, when you say, do you understand Russia? I don't think they completely understand what I just described, but they're beginning to sense it.
Yeah, well, how do you see, as I think most people now recognizing we're moving towards the final stages of this war, that is, more and more very significant breakthroughs are occurring at a, increasingly often. But how would this war end then? Not just for Ukraine, but also for NATO, given that a lot has changed since 2022. And again, initially NATO had, it was argued, had a new mission. It was stronger than ever before. But I guess a lot of this was premised on NATO actually defeating Russia. So now that we are, NATO heading for defeat, how do you see, what will, I guess, the transatlantic community look like at the end of this war?
Well, you just raised an important question. And you said transatlantic. Remember, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was composed really of states that bordered the Atlantic Ocean. It was never meant to be a continental structure. We transformed it in the 1990s into this growing, expanding continental structure. And the goal was to advance all the way to the Urals and beyond. In other words, to incorporate everybody into this sort of EU-NATO construct. That has clearly, indisputably failed. That's obvious. So if you're a Pole right now, and I was talking to some Poles recently, I asked them the very question. I said, what do you do? And I think the Poles, like many Europeans, for different kinds of reasons, keep looking for someone who's going to help to guarantee their existence. In other words, who's going to be daddy? Which, of course, was the word that Rutte used to describe the Europeans or something, or used to describe Trump as the sort of godfather of NATO, which of course Trump loves. That's music to his ears. And the truth is, there will be no godfather. De Gaulle saw this coming back in the 1960s. Bismarck back in the 1870s kept saying, all these decisions of importance have to be national decisions. They have to be based on national interests. This business of communal decision-making. He used to criticize the European collective, the concert of Europe, as nonsense. In other words, the Poles need to decide what's in their interest, and that's what I told them. And if you think that you can sign a deal with Washington that guarantees your security where you live, you're very much mistaken. You might as well go back to 1939 and make the very dumb decisions that you made at that point, when you always had to make a choice. You had to choose one way or the other. Is it going to be Germany or is it going to be the Soviet Union? You chose neither, and what happened? You were ground into bits by the Soviet Union and Germany. And by the way, Piłsudski, their leader at the time, he died obviously before this, but he warned on his deathbed, you've got to make a choice. Now, the Poles cannot build Fort Trump and gratify Trump's ego and expect that that is their ticket to permanent security and salvation. That's not going to work. We don't live in Europe. The Europeans live in Europe. None of the Europeans, frankly speaking, seem to want to be in close partnership with any of their neighbors. But the truth is that has to happen. And when you look at Ukraine right now, and you're right, this is grinding to a halt in Ukraine. It's coming to an end. Who decides what happens to the rest of Ukraine? Are the Poles, Lithuanians, Slovaks, Hungarians, Romanians, Moldovans, are they all going to say, well, we'll just wait here quietly until 800,000 or 900,000 Russian troops arrive on our borders? Or are they going to sit down with President Putin and his team and say, we're ready to talk about what this post-war Ukraine will look like? And they are the ones who need to have that conversation, not France, not Britain, and not Germany. Now, you can argue that the Germans, for reasons of history over the last 1,000 years, have deep roots in Central East Europe, no question about it. I think they ought to be very interested. But the rest of the West Europeans, absolutely not. What have they got to do with it? And what do we have to do with it? We can support it, and I think that's what President Trump should consider. We'll be happy to support such a conference, and we will sign on for the solution that you and Moscow reach collectively. And I think that could be done. But right now, no one is saying that. No one is thinking about that because the Poles are looking at the EU. They're looking at NATO. So is everybody else. And everybody says, well, I can't do that because I'm dependent on subsidies from the EU, new money from the EU money machine in Brussels. If I do that, then I lose access to the new money machine. Well, what if access to the new money machine sets you up as a target for future destruction in future wars that you don't want to fight because you're part of that organization called NATO and the EU? Eventually, people will come around to sorting through this, but right now, that's not where they are.